Welcome, brave listeners, to another frightening tale, presented by yours truly, Wilhelm. Tune in each week where I entertain my listeners with another dark tale of the paranormal, donated by authors from around the world. If you're an author of some paranormal fiction and would like to share a story with my listeners, submit one at frighteningtales.com. And while you're there, tune in for more than 30 hours of previous content. This week's tale was written by Gary Kilworth, a British science fiction, fantasy, and historical novelist. Gary spent 18 years as a Royal Air Force cryptographer. Then, in 1981, Gary became a full-time author and has penned more than 170 short stories and more than 80 novels across many genres. He prefers writing short stories that are enigmatic and strange. You can read Gary's latest book, The Rain Ghost, by Encyclopocalypse Publications, which was recently released at your local bookstore. Many of Gary's stories draw from his intimate knowledge of history, as does today's tale, a story he calls Image in a Dark Glass.
Even after 2 weeks away from the site, my room above Simi Harbor was a sanctuary, not only from the heat reflected by the barren Greek island's mountains, but from society. The village was small, but there was still many tourists, curious and gregarious, and to be avoided. When James was out at the dig with the students and I was not required, I preferred to read or write in my room rather than to sit at a taverna. Not that the room was anything special. The furnishings consisted of a table, chair, and bed, all with loosened joints, and on the walls a single faded poster beside the cracked mirror, so necessary to the vanity of James when he called on me. The morning was a particularly hot one, inducing more lethargy than usual in my movements. I dressed slowly in shorts and sleeveless shirt, breakfast on tea and melon, then made my way down the uneven steps to the harbor below. Thence through the back streets, smelling of fish mingled with oregano and donkey droppings, to a goat track that led to the site. After 20 minutes of walking through the valley, the site came into view. A ruined Turkish fort jammed on the pate of a mound and looking like the misshapen crown of a brooding prince. Beneath the fort was the second level, a castle built as an outpost of Rhodes by the Knights of St. John in the 11th century, and below it were 4 more levels, 6 then in all, with the promise of a 7th, each level holding a town or fortification from a different era. In the last century, Schliemann had encountered a similar series of historical layers when digging for Troy. Slimon the Butcher, they called him during my college days. Instead of sifting through each level like a modern archaeologist, he had blasted his way down with explosives in his eagerness to get to the gold of Troy, destroying everything and anything that stood between him and the fabled city. James was chatting to some students at the top of the dig. He smiled when he saw me, that easy grin he had for almost anyone except a rival. "Hello, Leonard. Hot walk, eh? You should come up with me in the early morning cool. The dawn is something to see here. Sun coming up from behind that hill." His dark eyes shone with enthusiasm, and 1 or 2 of the students nodded. "See?" he said. "They know. Some of them." There was a laughter, directed at the laggards like me who found it difficult to stir before the day came to a boil. "Anyway, how was your trip to Athens? Get what we wanted?" I nodded. The equipment will be shipped in a few days. How have you been faring? Found anything new? James shrugged. A few more pottery shards, nothing significant. He put an arm around my shoulder, and I felt the slight pressure as he indicated that we should move casually out of earshot of the students. A German girl. What was her name? Gabby? Smiled at me as she sipped her drink. They were a friendly bunch and eager to help, eager to please. Casually, I accompanied James to the edge of the steep northern slope, where he stood looking down over the foothills to the clear, blue Mediterranean waters below. What? I asked. We've reached it. I've reached it. The 7th level. And? Not much. Not yet. Haven't had a chance to explore properly. Keep it from the others for a while, though. It's not so much another level as a natural system of limestone caves underneath the lowest city. I knew what he meant. I had been down to the 6th level. It was not a case of just dropping down vertically like an elevator shaft. One had to move laterally on each level, find the passages, find the room, find the entrance to another level. We were cautious about our discoveries. It was not so much that we mistrusted our helpers, but, well, if the prize is big enough, who can be trusted? One begins to find patriotic reasoning for removing treasures for the benefit of one's own nation. When we had arrived at Simi, it was not expected that the site would be as important as it subsequently turned out to be. No 8th level, then? I said. James shook his head. Extremely doubtful. 7 is pre-Homeric. Maybe there's a Neolithic site, but it's doubtful. That's more likely to be down by the stream on the south side. I agreed with him. So, when do we get a good look at 7? Tonight? He nodded slowly. Maybe. It's night down there all the time, so the hour is irrelevant. Leonard? He looked at me straight in the eye. I lied to you just a few moments ago. I have found something. Okay, I smiled. You're entitled to an aberration or two. You've done most of the work. He looked a little distressed at my attitude. It's more serious than that. I really was going to keep it from you. I think I became greedy there for a while. That's bad, isn't it? I want it for me alone. I felt like a wronged wife at confession time, and the feeling was uncomfortable, to say the least. Forget it, James. You couldn't do it anyway. That's the important thing. The boyish grin returned to his face, and he looked relieved. James was 27, a year older than I, but I often felt like his father. If I ever had a son, I hoped he would be like James in most respects. Well, spill the beans, I said. What? Oh, yes. Well, it isn't an ornamental pool. I haven't had a chance to look at it properly yet, but it's obviously something important. The doors to the cavern. Cavern? Yeah, that thick, solid wood. He held his hands about 2 feet apart. Probably cedar. How did you get in? Were they locked? Yes, I blew the lock. Hell, James! I was a little angry now. I know shades of Schleiman. Well, I got excited, but I was careful, Leonard. Just enough for the job. I wasn't thinking of that. You could have caused a cave-in down there. You could have killed yourself. Well, I took a chance. I had to see behind those doors. You know what it's like, Leonard. It's another time. You feel you're all alone. No one but you in the whole world. Remember when you climbed up to the Turkish fort and stood on that pinnacle of rock? You told me later that you felt as if the world belonged only to you and the goats. All laws suspended. You were the supreme judge of what was right and wrong. If you did something, it was right because there was no one to counter your claims. Well, it was like that, without the goats. What did you use? I had a little plastique with me for emergencies. He looked shamefaced, and I shook my head. Sometimes, James. I know. You won't tell Cheryl. Promise me. Still, he became enthusiastic. It's such a strange place, Leonard. Marble surrounds, mosaics, rich in rock carvings. You should see it. Well, I will. And I won't. Tell Cheryl, that is. One of the students brought a bottle of wine over to us, and I thanked him. You're welcome, he said. Are we starting again soon? Not long. A few more minutes. He walked back to his friends. The accent had been a little musical. Dutch? Or perhaps Danish? Keen, said James. They're all very, very keen. So were you as an undergraduate? I suppose so, he sighed. I asked, is it a bath, do you think? He pursed his lips. It's the wrong shape. I know not everyone has a fond of symmetry as the Romans, but this is, I don't know, it's pond-shaped. The kind of pool you might find in a country walk, in the shade of some willows under a line of poplars. You've been reading too much Houseman, I said. No, really, it is, except that its banks are smooth marble and there's a symbol cut into the surface of the marble. Did you recognize it? Yes, a circle attached to a cross, the mirror of Venus. We went back to the others after that and finished the wine with them. I was aware that alcohol would make them sleepy and a little careless, but most of them were moderate in their habits, and I was no sergeant major, with a rule book under one arm and a pace stick under the other. Those who overindulged were subtly assigned the heavy duties, like shoring up the tunnels. I stayed on for a while when the main work had been finished, as was my habit. I had the idea that I had to make up for the time I lost in the early mornings, though no one would have challenged me had I not done so. Before he left, James said in a low voice, "No trying it out for yourself. Wait for me. You don't know the way." I nodded, thinking, neither did you, but you went anyway. But I stayed on the 5th level, working in a room that had once been an armory. 2 of the students stayed with me. James had to get to a telephone by 6 o'clock. He rang his fiancée in London every night to reaffirm his feelings for her. I thought it was sweet, but a little unnecessary and expensive. Still, James was one of those men who needs to show their affection. He was a romantic, and demonstrating love was, for him, the only proper behavior for a man who was in love. If I had heard Cheryl's name once, I'd heard it a dozen times a day since we've been on Simmy. He had made me promise that I would not tell her he had blown the lock on the doors to the pool, as if she, a dental assistant, would understand anything. If he had told her it was the proper procedure, she would have believed him in her ignorance, little knowing that blasting's one way into antiquity was tantamount to dynamiting a stubborn molar in a patient's jaw. I was wonderfully quiet when the main body of the workforce had gone. All I could hear was the clinking of trowels and an occasional murmur in German between my helpers. James was right. It was like being in another time. Above, around, and below me were cities of a former sun, streets and houses that had once been full of other races, other tongues, proud tongues. The Dorian iron swords that I was carefully uncovering with my airbrush had been wielded by one set of my ancestors to kill another set of my ancestors. They were all part of me, predator and prey, attacker and defender, aggressor and underdog. Now I was moving through the labyrinth of tunnels that had once been their streets, clawing and crawling in the darkness where they had walked in the light. Old cities, especially subsurface ones, gave me a funny feeling in my psyche. Their halls are not just inhabited by ghosts. They are crammed with them, wall to wall. You have to work in the artificial light of your helmet lamp with a room full of attendant ghosts as thick as a London fog, watching your every painstaking move, as if ready to hand you the tools as you need them. Further, should they witness some desecration, some invasion of sanctity, they might begin a mighty clamor, loud enough to drive you mad. Archaeologists who had emerged from underground sites with lunatic staring eyes, gibbering drivel, were not uncommon. Gute Nacht, my German attendants left, but it was some while before James turned up, and I was a little annoyed with him when he explained that he had taken the time to have a haircut in the village. Why he had to look and dress so impeccably on a place like Simi was beyond me. "Let's go," he said. We began the trek down 2 more levels, the lamps on our helmets creating bizarre shadows in the lightless, unpeopled streets of a former nation. We tend to remember the Bronze Age as being populated by noble warriors, but the majority must have been fishermen, farmers, herdsmen, tradesmen, craftsmen, and shopkeepers. These were their houses and their places of trade. The carpenter's workshop, the fishmonger's market, the grain merchant's storerooms. Our little army of students had uncovered many of the chambers until the whole hill was like a hollow honeycomb with passages running laterally and horizontally. We dropped down through the floor of a wine merchant's shop, down again through the floor of his cellar by rope ladder, into the 6th level. Mycenaean era, circa 1400 to 1200 BC. Then again along winding passages, through corridors of darkness almost as tangible as the stone that contained it. It seemed to me that the deeper we went, the thicker became the dark, as if it were an element that increased in density under pressure. Not just an absence of light, but a positive mass which threatened to suffocate us. The deeper we went, the hotter and more oppressive it became. I followed James the last part of the way until we were in a system of natural limestone caves, improved upon, if that is the right phrase, by the use of tools and human craft. They were damp and glistening in the unnatural light of our miners' lamps. Underneath our feet, the floor was undulated where flowing water had left ripples in the rock. The furrows were wide apart, which meant the flow was leisurely. At least we would not be swept away by floodwaters. If Mycenae was legend, we were now in the halls of pure mythology. "Did you phone Cheryl?" I whispered, trying to introduce something mundane into the ancient atmosphere. Yes, she is okay. Looking forward to Christmas, of course. His tone was blunted by the limestone walls around us, blocked by the timbers that supported our fragile honeycomb above. It had been a mistake. To think that talk of ordinary matters would help remind me of an outside world, a here and now. It merely emphasized that we were deep in the bowels of another place entirely, the inner kingdom of the past, an age when gods were as numerous as mortals, and their ranks as vast as the armies of men and women that served them. From the most insignificant naiad that presided over the smallest of springs to the mighty Zeus, they had shared an era with mankind, severed from becoming historical fact only by a faded belief in their actual existence. "Here it is," said James, the light from his lamp picking out two great doors, slightly ajar, but not wide enough for a man to enter. "They're stiff. I need your help to open them all the way." He gave me a sheepish grin and I shrugged. We both put our shoulders to one of the doors and gradually forced it open. We entered a cavern. James had obviously been able to see through the gap, but not been strong enough to force his way inside. It smelt musty and old. I mentioned this to James, who replied, "When the charge blew the lock, the air came hissing out, as if it had been sealed since they were last closed. It stank. Over 3,000 years, after all." "We'll have to be careful, James. Your charge might have weakened the supports in the level above." "You worry too much," he interrupted, almost brusquely. "Look, the pool." Apart from the quick glance I thought through the gap of the doors, you and I are the first to see this since our old Greek friends. Out of respect for you, I didn't even step inside. Let's do it in style, kid." He did a sort of half skip through the doorway and cried, "Ta-da-da!" with one arm outstretched, as if introducing a guest on a television program. "Fool," I said, not unkindly. His lamplight swept over the dark, glittering surface of the water. It was a black mirror. A tossed stone might shatter it like glass, and it held me fascinated while the light was played back and forth over its dead still flatness. Around it were statues, seemingly carved out of the base marble that held the pool in its smooth hollow, but not statues of people or animals, not even of mythological beasts, but of trees, bushes, and flowers. A petrified glade. Each tiny leaf, each petal was finely wrought, each twig, each branch frozen in the act of submitting to some bygone breeze of ancient days. There were even trampled patches of sculptured grass, and the spoor of deer at the edge of the pool where they had dipped their heads to drink. I was riveted to the sight. It frightened me for some reason, a fear my mind had extracted from the very roots of racial memory. It was an instinctive fear, irrational and without a name. Those stone blossoms had a gray coldness that robbed them of any comparison beyond a superficial resemblance to the real blooms. They were the brittle crustaceans of a tomb to a dead world. The trunks of the trees were ugly, unlike the warm friendliness of real trees, in which one could detect woody faces amid the knots and whorls in the bark. These stone trees leered at me with sick expressions, cold and strangely evil. The effect was weird beyond explanation. I was drained of all comprehension. Why? Tremendous, isn't it? Breathed James. I could feel his hand on my shoulder. You can see why why I nearly cut you out of it. I wanted it all for myself. Fame. This hunger in archaeologists for recognition, for the one great discovery. It almost ruined a perfect friendship. The last two words delivered frivolously. I suspect because of embarrassment, but I was hardly paying attention. When I moved my head, the shadows of trees with marble leaves danced upon mottled stone banks. Even the water looked as if it was made of slate, I said. James suddenly bent and dipped a finger in the pool. Velvet rings rippled across the surface. Real water, he chuckled. Yes, but how did it get here? There's no stream in here. The roof looks dry. This whole scene just doesn't make any sense, James. His voice took on a hard tone. What the hell are you talking about? It's here, isn't it? And we found it, Leonard. That fanciful imagination of yours is going to cost us one day. This is real. Get a grip on yourself. A reversal of roles. He was now the father figure, and I full of misgivings and forebodings. Why was I giving way to mild hysteria? I was usually the strong, dependable one, the calm assessor of factual evidence. Facts. The facts were these. We were in a chamber that, contrary to most of our honeycomb of cities, was free of soil. There was a pool of water in its center, yet there was no inlet. Surrounding the pool was a petrified glade. Let's get back now, James, I said. I think I've seen enough. We can... Wait a minute. I want to look around a bit first. You go if you're unhappy here. I'll be okay. From a distance, I stared at the dark, inviting surface of the pool, and then moved further away. A thought had slipped into my mind, had been sidling its way in ever since we had entered the chamber. Why did you do that? Back off like that, he said. I don't want to look into the pool. You're crazy, Leonard. What's the matter with you? It's only water, for Christ's sake. Is it? I think it is. You obviously have some cranky idea in your head about, I don't know what. What is it? Witchcraft? Something like that? What? Older? Older than what? Witchcraft? Yes. You really have flipped, man. I stepped outside the chamber and left him to it. My legs were trembling slightly and I felt hot. I wanted to light a cigarette, but the air was thin enough down here as it was, without burning up oxygen. It was then I heard it, a rumbling from further down the passage. James! I began running as the rumble increased in volume until a thunderous crash echoed along the tunnel. Dust filled the air and I fell to my knees, choking in its thick clouds. I heard the screech of timber against timber and felt reverberations shake the floor beneath me. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling forward, and walked into a wall of wood, earth, and stone. As the dust began to clear, my helmet lamp picked out the huge blocks that had once served as a wall on the level above. Shoring timbers from the upper tunnels were mangled and split, wedged between me and the outside world. I began tearing at the blockage in panic, filling my palms with splinters, screaming, "James! Help me! James! James!" Finally, I backed away from the collapse, realizing that my individual efforts were ineffectual. I needed James to clear it with me, and he still had not come. All the claustrophobic feelings of childhood rose to my throat then. I remembered a locked cupboard at a birthday party with me on the inside, a sand tunnel I had dug in the dunes on a beach which collapsed on me, my father having to dig me out with frantic haste, a vehicle accident as an adolescent, with me trapped in the driver's seat upside down on a lone highway at night. Everyone has one or two experiences during their lifetime where they have been trapped in an enclosed space in the darkness. The panic was impossible to control. It was not the sort of terror at that moment that induces high action brought on by rushing adrenaline. It was the kind that freezes the victim into immobility. I stared at the pile of rubble before me. It could have been a mountain. There was not enough faith in me to move a muscle, let alone a barrier of rock and earth. I think I was whimpering for a while. Gradually, the fear began to dissipate, until I was at least able to think with some resemblance of reasoning. I waited a long time for James to join me. A long time. Finally, I found the courage to go back inside the room again. His helmet was lodged in the stone branches of a tree, spotlighting him as he knelt by the pool. He was staring at the still surface. I walked up to him and looked down on his handsome reflection, his classical features. It was a fine face, a face I felt I'd always admired. James. He remained unmoved, as he were unaware of my presence. He only had eyes for himself. James, there's been a collapse. You must have heard it. We have to clear it before we can get out. They don't know we're down here. We'll suffocate. If we don't find a way through, the air pumps, they can't reach us. He did not even acknowledge my presence. It was as if he had hypnotized himself. I knelt beside him, my own eyes drawn to his reflection in the water. James, you know the story. You know how it ended. You must remember what happened to Narcissus. He gave no answer. James, what about Cheryl? Think of Cheryl. For a long time I stood there, sharing the vision of his mere image with him. I avoided looking at my own face, but his was magnetic. I studied every line, the curve of his jaw, the dark of his eyes, set wide, the prominent cheekbones, the narrow nose, the smooth brow. There was a stirring in my breast which I fought to keep at bay. I had lived with a lack of fulfillment all my life, and was I now to die with it? With great effort, I managed to urge him again to clear our path to the next level. We can't sit here doing nothing, I said. I need you to help me. Finally, without looking up, he allowed me 3 words, delivered in a tone half bored, half irritated. Go away, Leonard, he said. When the lamps went out, some 7 hours later, I crawled away and somehow managed to burrow between the timbers and rock, like a mole. It was too late for James. His hand had been colder than flesh, and harder, much harder.
Thank you, brave listeners, for joining me on another dark story. This week's tale was Image in a Dark Glass, as written by Gary Kilworth. I urge all my listeners to go out and find more content by our weekly authors. If you're not too timid, you can find Gary's latest book, The Rain Ghost, at your local bookstore. Fans of Frightening Tales can show their support by collecting merchandise available at frighteningtales.com. If today's story entertained you, please click the thumbs up like button. And if you'd like to hear more stories, then click the subscribe button and tune in each week for another frightening tale, if you're brave enough.